but she is a professional organizer, a life coach, and a public speaker. Helen actually holds a master's degree in human services with a graduate certificate in professional counseling. The only reason I know that is because I wrote her website. Thanks, Helen. In her spare time, Helen enjoys dancing, teaching group fitness, and enjoying the occasional sweet guilty pleasure. Today she's going to be talking about resilience, the art of bouncing back. Will you please help me welcome Helen Stringer?
3 years ago, I had the opportunity to hear an artist by the name of Phil Hansen speak at the TEDx KC event. And his story was really incredible, and it stuck with me ever since. I think you can glean a lot of things from his story, but what I recall most is this illustration of resilience within his story. So, actually, wait on that. When he was in art school, he developed a shake in his hand. He described this shake as, quote, the destruction of his dream of becoming an artist. Phil was a pointillism artist. He spent years making art out of tiny little dots. This shake turned those tiny little dots into something more like tadpoles. To compensate, he would grip the pen even tighter, and that actually made the shake even worse. So discouraged, he left art school and considered quitting art altogether. But he found himself still drawn to art and finally went to a neurologist and discovered that he had permanent nerve damage. The doctor looked at the squiggly line he had just drawn and asked, "Why don't you just embrace the shake?" So he did. He went home and began making scribble pictures like this one. We're a little off center there. He realized he had to find a different approach to make art. He still enjoyed the fragmentalism of pointillism, but began looking for different ways to express that, such as using his feet to paint this picture on plywood. Now, the scope of this is, most of his artwork is huge, like they're on a very grand scale. So he did this one on plywood called Paul, completely with his feet. So he discovered that if he worked on a larger scale and with 2D materials, he could better embrace his shake. These happen to be the center of the gauze in your Band-Aids. And it looks just like you think it looks, like blood. So he used those little pieces with his own blood, how I don't know the full scope of that, to make this picture of Kim Jong-un called The Value to Blood. And this is also very, very large. This is the zoom in of another piece. These are dandelion puffs, which he used to make this face of Mother Teresa. Later, he had the idea of using people's stories to create the content for his art. For 6 days, he worked on this one and received stories from people about events that changed their life. Their stories literally became the art. This one's called The Art of Philanthropy. So this includes stories of philanthropy representing 78 countries, written in a permanent marker on a live webcam feed. It was then finished live at the Red Cross headquarters in Washington, D.C., and then debuted in New York City's Times Square. So you can see the scale of this one, but literally he just heard a feed of the stories and with permanent marker was able to do this kind of work. Really incredible. It's another picture. The really fun, one of my favorite things that he's done is he started creating art not to display, but to be destroyed. That's this one right here. This is a Jimi Hendrix, completely made out of matches, and there's a video online of it burning, so the only evidence we still have is just of the video. And you can actually find his artwork. If you Google Phil Hansen artist, he has all kinds of video and other things that he's done that's really, really incredible. And he has a TED Talk, obviously, and that's online as well. So he was faced with quitting a passion that he had because of a shake his body had suddenly developed. He took something that could have ended a passion and made it something even more incredible and beautiful. And I would venture to say that I think what he's turned, this shake into might be even more beautiful and incredible than if he had just been a pointillism artist. So what we are really talking about when we discuss resilience is actually stress resistance. Resilience refers to a person's ability to adapt successfully to acute stress, trauma, or more chronic forms of adversity. So a resilient individual has thus been tested by adversity and continues to demonstrate adaptive, physiological, and psychological stress responses. As a human species, we are naturally incredibly resilient. We wouldn't be where we are, who we are today, if we were not. Now, even though we naturally have this tendency to be resilient, have you ever wondered why some people tend to bounce back from serious setbacks or trauma and others don't? What was it about the way Phil dealt with his shake that other resilient people seem to share? Now, I do want to note that I am not in any way not acknowledging the real trauma and feelings of loss and despair that many circumstances in life cause us to feel. The pain and turmoil people feel due to extreme stress, loss is real and legitimately devastating. What I'm hoping to do is just simply answer the question, what do resilient people have in common? And I can only share a few of those with you. I don't have enough time. So I'm going to talk about 3 different elements. The first one is realistic optimism. Dutch swimmer Martin van der Wiegen's early swimming career was halted by a diagnosis of leukemia. He once shared that he didn't meet many realistic people in sports, and it was the same in the hospital. Just like with swimming, the cancer ward was full of people that felt by thinking positive, they had the upper hand against cancer. But Martin felt that they were full of false hope. Although he recognized that his chances of surviving were actually 30%, friends would tell him not to think about his low chances and to keep his mind on the positives. Martin shared, quote, "There was a big gap between my idea of hope and their ideas of hope. For me, hope was chemotherapy. It was science. When you think of it this way, it's really weird to say that positive thinking helps you." Martin simply couldn't tell himself that everything was going to be okay. He felt strong that he must admit to himself the reality of what was happening. Only then could he begin to take steps to actually deal with it. So, what did he do? Well, he set small goals for himself. Goals such as get through the week alive, get through the day with minimal pain, to survive chemotherapy, to make it through the stem cell transplant that ultimately saved his life. 3 years later, and cancer-free, he slipped back into swimming. Now this time, he decided to use the same type of realistic yet forward-thinking that had gotten him through leukemia. He shared that he felt his odds of successfully returning to swimming were actually pretty small. He already knew that he wasn't the fastest swimmer, and that was actually true pre-cancer. He recognized that he would have to train extra hard to get to the level he was at before his illness and work even harder to make up for his natural shortfalls. Now, instead of setting out to win races, he set out to simply do his best in small competitions. But over the next 5 years, he qualified for some of the most elite competitions, eventually actually landing in the 2008 Beijing Olympics. Now, knowing that he wasn't the strongest athlete present, he swam at the back of the pack, avoiding the slipstream, and at the last minute pulled ahead, clinching the gold. Now, to observers, Martin's comeback may seem amazing. However, Martin believed he was not a hero. He simply believed he had survived a trauma. And as for getting cancer, in his mind, it had nothing to do with winning the gold. However, the media made him another famous cancer survivor. He would say, quote, "Don't call me Lance Armstrong." Now, this is before Lance Armstrong's most recent drug. It was right, he was taking drug enhancement. This is before that. So he took offense to the string of comments that world-famous cycler had made about positive thinking, survival, and victory. Because Lance was often known to say, "Without cancer, I would have never won the Tour de France." This is the kind of stuff he would say. Martin, on the other hand, calls this kind of public statement dangerous. So you may be wondering, aren't there studies that support these notions of positive thinking and surviving cancer and influencing your mortality rate? In an article published in the Journal of Behavioral Medicine and Psychological Bulletin, they reported significant flaws in previous research studies. Small samples, lack of clearly specified hypotheses, and inappropriate methods to analyze interpret results. So in plain English, the conclusions that positive thinking affects survival was based on biased and flawed research. So to be fair, all studies have flaws. We all recognize that. But when a great deal of research has methodological flaws, as this report shared, it's possible that positive thinking isn't quite as powerful as a lot of people seem to think. That's not to say that positive thinking is never helpful under any circumstances, because it can be. But I'll note, I said realistic optimism. So keep that in mind. There's still a level of realistic hope when we have optimism. Now, and we can also know that everyone knows that you can find exceptions to any rule if you look in the right places. So this study alluded to one more thing though. There may be inherent danger in elevating positive thinking to too powerful of a position, a danger Martin seemed to spend quite some time considering while battling cancer. So the supporters of positive thinking get to have it their way no matter what. So if people succeed at work, thrive at life, or survive an illness, those supporters get to say, see, it was positive thinking that did it. People don't succeed, don't thrive, or the very unfortunate ones don't survive. Supporters of positive thinking can say, they just didn't think positively enough. If they had, everything would have been okay. Or, we could say even worse, if it was their own doubts and negative thinking that caused their misfortune, which is just a tragedy. Anyone remember, I think it was in the 90s, Stuart Smalley, he would, this was SNL, so he would start his self-help show, look at himself in the mirror and say, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people, yes, I feel like he's the perfect picture of like an extreme of the positive thinking. But you know, this was right up when a lot of the positive psychology stuff was starting to roll out, and I love the positive psychology stuff, don't get me wrong at all, but I think it's kind of interesting that SNL caught on to some of the irony that was so rich with this whole thinking of kind of fooling yourself into positive thinking without having a realistic level to it. Conventional wisdom says that positive thinking after a tragedy leads to better outcomes, right? So when the bottom drops out, having a rosy attitude is better than thinking the worst, right? Yet, for more than half a century, psychologists have debated the face value of the power of positive thinking. Those arguing for this perspective assert that positive thinking is nothing less than an antidote to threatening illness and the secret to achieving success in life. You can thank mid-century Protestant preacher Norman Vincent Peale for this view in his book, which kind of started it all, called The Power of Positive Thinking, where he offered a doctrine gilded by an appealing promise. Positive thinking can bring positive realities. I'm getting my, what's that guy's name, Deepak Chopra or whatever? Do I sound inspiring like him? This may have been the jumping off point for thousands of self-help books and The Secret to Fortune. So research shows that telling you everything is going to be all right could undermine your ability to take action to make your situation better. People who pay attention to the positives at the expense of noticing the potential for negatives, who believe that everything is or will be fine despite there being real risk, may not take appropriate action to protect themselves. Their lack in belief in their own susceptibility could seriously be dangerous. Currently, the most supported psychosocial influence on cancer survival rate is something called supportive expressive therapy. So this is when therapists encourage patients to experience and express their thoughts or feelings, no matter what they are, positive or negative. And they often do this in group settings. Speaking frankly about these topics often makes them less scary. To avoid them would simply be denying the reality one is facing. What makes Martin's story of resilience special is his ability to stop thinking positively and start thinking realistically, to avoid the comforting fiction that everything will be fine, and instead to bravely ask, what now? Looking straight in the face of your circumstances and accepting reality allows you to figure out what is within your control that you can exert some level of influence over. It propels you to action, not wishful thinking. The artist I mentioned earlier, Hanson's realization that he must first become limited to become limitless is one of his coined sayings. He embraced his shake. He accepted the nerve damage, reframed his perspective, exerted personal control over his circumstances, and used his problem-solving skills to do something possibly even more creative than he would have done prior to the nerve damage. he found ways to be realistically optimistic, a term coined by psychologist David Feldman in his book Super Survivors, The Surprising Link Between Suffering and Success. Now, according to 2 decades of research, on average 50 to 80% of people who have lived with a trauma say that they've grown in some way, even though they've experienced so much pain and suffering. Even in the midst of pain, they've opened up to embrace new options and new choices. This is an incredible testament to the power of the human spirit in the face of tragedy. Trauma closes off certain choices in our lives, yet when we look at the situation eyes fully open, and sometimes with the help of a friend, we can see new possibilities and new options. So building one's choices on a firm understanding of reality reminds me of one of our values. So I know our values banner's up there, but one of our values is reality is known through reason. So not only are we a reality-based community, but we are forward-focused, we are optimistic. We do have realistic optimism here at Oasis. Now before I move on, I am in no way saying that there is no power in being optimistic. But I think there is something to be said about having a realistic level to your hope and balancing those two. So the second element that actually is something that is an outpouring, I would say, of of realistic optimism, is that resilience takes time. In 1884, future President Theodore Roosevelt's wife and mother died only hours apart. I don't know if you guys know about this story. Roosevelt was at work in the New York State Legislature attempting to get a government reform bill passed when he was summoned home by his family. He returned home to find his mother, Minnie, had succumbed to typhoid fever. On the same day, his wife of 4 years, Alice Lee, died of Bright's disease, a severe kidney ailment. Only 2 days before her death, Alice Lee had given birth to this couple's daughter, Alice. The double tragedy devastated Roosevelt. He ordered those around him to not mention his wife's name. Burdened by his grief, he abandoned politics, left the infant Alice with his sister Bammy, and at the end of 1884, struck out to the Dakota Territories, where he lived as a rancher and worked as a sheriff for 2 years. When not engrossed in raising cattle or acting as sheriff or as a local lawman, he found time to indulge his passion in reading and writing history. After a blizzard wiped out his prized cattle in 1885, Roosevelt decided to return to Eastern society. Once back in New York in 1886, he took up politics again and took over raising his daughter Alice. It took Roosevelt over 2 years to overcome his grief. 2 years for him to return to politics and actually become one of our more respected presidents. Perceived resilience takes time. Phil Hansen didn't bounce back overnight. It took him a few years to be realistically optimistic and actually embrace the shake to finally do something about it and find out how to make it work for him. Martin, he had to fight cancer. I think it was 3 years it said, and then 5 years of training. It's 8 years. Few things happen overnight, even though it appears that way. Our perception can often be deceiving. Bouncing back takes time, often years. Accepting that is key. It's part of that realistic optimism. The last element that I'm going to talk about today is social support. So if you guys have been a part of Oasis for a while, you've heard me talk about the power of having really great connections and relationships, but a lot of you are new, so I'll give you a really just short gist of it. But one of the really fascinating things about social support systems is that it actually increases your longevity, especially the older you are. The more meaningful connections you have with other people, the longer you'll live. It's really, really fascinating. Also, having excellent social support systems is as good for your health as quitting smoking, eating right, exercising, all the host of the things that doctors tell you that we should be doing, of course. And you never have them ask you this. You go to the doctor and they ask you, all those host of questions. Are you eating right? Do you exercise? How much do you drink? How much do you smoke? They never go, how many friends do you have? What's your social life like? Because they should be. Because it really has just as much an influence over our well-being and life satisfaction as all that other stuff. And it's a whole lot more fun. At least I'm an extrovert, so I can say it's a whole lot more fun in that sense. But it's important for everyone, whether you're an introvert or extrovert. The emotional support happens to be what matters most within these relationships. Emotional support is a buffer for the effects of trauma and other stress, and is one of the predictors of post-traumatic growth, the tendency of some individuals to find benefits in the aftermath of tragedy. Breast cancer support groups are a really good example of this. They share their experiences of loss, loss of hair, loss of breasts, loss of functioning, and often the loss of life. Talking about challenging realities of fighting cancer help these women reframe their cancer by making it less scary. Shared experience, a sense of solidarity, and knowing that you're not alone. Now at Oasis, we get to occasionally experience something similar through our community moments. Our KC Oasis community has been incredibly vulnerable and frank about their mental health challenges. And I think it has made our community that much stronger. A couple months ago, a KC Oasian who's here, Amanda Cower, shared about her deep struggle with depression. She didn't sugarcoat anything, opening up with how she really sucks at killing herself. Yeah, she was really good at creating the same humor. It was incredible. With careful humor, she shared how she struggled with depression, but it also gave us some insight for those of us who haven't faced that to know, well, how can we help you? How can we support you? How should we talk to you with such things that often our society often pushes under the rug or clouds with shame. We don't hide from that here, and I think that's powerful. I will admit her community moment was definitely one of the most gritty, but her courage and frank honesty is still something that has helped so many people in this community, and I think still is helping today. Not only does it foster a sense of solidarity, but for solidarity for challenges, our culture tends to be quiet about. I mentioned that. But it also helps us be inspired by our friends to know that we are not alone, that we can move forward. Amanda actually happened to give a community moment a couple weeks ago and shared that if it wasn't for her KC Oasis family, she may not have been as resilient, and her recovery may not have gone as well as it has been. And I think that's just really, really makes me speechless. It's incredible. It's stories like Amanda's that often really do leave me without words. What we are capable of doing with communities like Oasis is seriously profound. It goes much further beyond this Sunday event, which is wonderful, and I love it. But because of Oasis, we get opportunities to have shared resources. Think about the practical things. Something goes wrong, you need help with your car, you want to learn how to knit, or there's a skill or a need that we have that kind of practical connection. And then on another level, emotional support, because I mentioned before that was the biggest element of this social support, was having this ability to have friends. And sometimes our friends can help us see outside of our own life. When we're dealing with our own challenges, we tend to kind of become overwhelmed by the stress hormones, and then we don't see outside of our own box, and having other people to kind of speak into that, whether it's from something up front or if it's one-on-one or from a group, there's all kinds of opportunities within communities like this. And then also at Oasis, we have the chance to celebrate life. Life can be really wonderful and awesome, and also life can be pretty shitty too. I used a swear word, and that was on my Facebook thing, right? I heard it's supposed to make you more trustworthy or something. I don't know if that's true or not. Hoping it works for me. But seriously, life can be pretty crappy. And having a community like this to support you when life is inevitably, it happens to all of us, it just happens. To have that support system around you, and however you need that support, it's here. So communities like Oasis help foster the two main threads that I talked about today of resiliency. We are a community grounded in reason, hence fostering realistic optimism. We are a community providing multiple opportunities for social support. So this leads me to propose that it's possible that humanists, or those of us who feel at home at Oasis, may be more resilient than other populations. We have this potential to be resilient, but we do need communities like Oasis. Together, we can help each other resist the inevitable stressors of life. Now, I figured most people expected me to come today and maybe tell you great stories of people who overcame things, kind of maybe like Phil Hansen or the swimmer Martin. or Steve Jobs. You can think of a handful of people who have overcome some really interesting odds. But you know what? When I started to really think about it, we are all super survivors in some way. We all have a story to tell of overcoming or fighting against life's unpredictable stressors. The secret of super survivors, your secret, shouldn't be secret anymore. We need to hear each other's stories of overcoming, whether in conversation or through a community moment. Together, we can make each other more resilient. So I leave you today with this. Congratulations. I deem you all super survivors, empowered by reason, connected by compassion.